Hmm. I am tempted to make a video, but I'm not sure exactly what about. I do feel though that I would like to make it really long. Maybe it won't end up being really long, but it's possible. I'd like to make it really long because I feel like there are things that I would like to talk about that can't be spoken about in a few minutes. And it's not because I can't talk about them. It's sort of because I can't allow myself to talk about them or something like that. There is an allowance I'm not giving myself. And I'm not giving myself that allowance partly, I think, because of emotions. That is to say, this allowing is not conscious, but it is driven by emotion. What is emotion? So emotion, I think, has something to do with movement. That's something I've been thinking about recently. It has something to do with movement. And movement towards a place that isn't sort of immediately obvious. I think a thought that I'm having in my head recently is that emotion has something to do with speculation. This speculation may be real, like you can, let's say, speculate that someone is going to hit you, and they do, right? So, for example, you can have an emotion in you that someone's going to hit you, and they do. So the emotion can be true in this sense. It can reach some sort of true conclusion. It even doesn't need to be future oriented. It can be about something that's happening right now. You could speculate that someone is sad, and they are. Like later, if you ask them, you find out that they were. If you take their word for it and all of that. Even, of course, I want to leave it really open-ended, because if we talk about synchronicity and magic and weird shit like that on this channel, I would also like to mention that, of course, a speculation can be true in a way that it goes even beyond what we think is true. So you could speculate something about the current situation, the current world, that is true in a strange paranormal way that you can't even imagine, other worlds, other imaginations. But we don't really need to go there necessarily, but I just want to leave it open enough so that when we're speaking about speculation, I don't necessarily mean something that's untrue. I mean more something that you can't see, something that's hidden. So it could be hidden in a lot of ways, in a paranormal way or in a non-paranormal way. It doesn't really matter. But in that case then, so what is this? What do I mean by speculation? I think speculation is sort of like, thinking about things that are not immediately apparent. I just have a feeling that emotion has something to do with that, and that thought has to do with the opposite of that in some way. That thought has to do with things that are apparent, but it is kind of like the way I'm thinking about it recently is like a deep dive, a study and an analysis of things that are apparent. So things that are apparent when analyzed, when brought to their different sort of constituent parts or something, I think that's what thought is in some way. And so thought and emotion seem to maybe wave between one another. They seem to be two sides of one same process, because emotion, perhaps, right, in its speculative character, can reveal things that you didn't know. So things that weren't apparent. If you speculate about something, it can lead you in a direction that thought hadn't contemplated, because it hadn't seen it, right? But that possibility can be just as real. It's just that it hadn't been seen, and therefore thought can't look at it because it wasn't seen. It was invisible in some way. And in this way, then, thought. Right, so we've got that possible distinction. So, emotion then, I think, is this speculative thing. Emotion seems to be a place where we can get stuck a lot. And another theory I've been kind of thinking about recently is that it feels to me that you could place emotion below thought. I don't like doing this because it makes it seem as if thought is superior morally to emotion, like thought is above emotion and therefore is better than emotion. But I don't mean this. I simply mean that in my way of imagining thoughts and emotions and their relationship, I tend to want everything to be very symmetrical. So I want, like, emotion and thought to occupy perfect conjunctions in some symmetrical space. But I've been thinking that maybe one way of modeling this is that it isn't symmetrical, that emotion is below thought, and thought is above emotion, and emotion is above physical sensation and physical behavior. That's the feeling I've been having. What do I mean by this? Physical behavior seems to be something that can acquire a certain, okay, I don't know where to go with this. Part of this is also me trying to think in a slightly more historically sort of centered way, because there are probably, ways of thinking of thought, what we understand of as thought, as being like emerging in some way. I don't like using that word, but it doesn't matter. We've got reptiles, mammals of different kinds, human beings. And we tend to associate thought, as we understand it, with a human kind of thing. And I can already sense, trying to talk about this, that the problem is I don't know enough about biology to even be talking about this. So really, I don't really know what my point is. So let's try and keep it close to what I can say. What I can say is I'm interested in this idea in any way that maybe our experience is built in layers, kind of thing, like a machine, or like a structure of different kinds, like a tree, right? A tree has got the sort of, I don't know, a core, and then different layers of bark kind of envelop the core of the tree, or bones and so on, and a structure therefore can be built out of different parts, and very often maybe the early parts are going to be kept somewhere in the structure, even though there are older parts that are placed on top of them, right? And and this is what I mean, of course, in my opinion, that no part is better than another. Just because one part came later or is placed outside of the structure as a surface to it, doesn't mean it's better. And also, it doesn't necessarily mean, in my view, that it came first or that it came later when we're talking about the psyche and subjective experience, which is what I'm trying to do. Because when we're talking about subjective experience, the idea that something came first or something came later is a little suspicious to me, at least. Maybe it's worth just continually thinking about. I understand that in biology there's a way in which you could say that certain structures in the human body sort of historically appeared first and others appeared later. I think there's zones of the brain that were there in the early stages of the brain, and parts of the brain, like from what I understand, the neocortex or whatever, which are later. So there is this notion of lateness and earliness. But when we're talking about the psyche, of course, in some way we sort of have to connect it with the physical body in a way, I think. But at the same time, in a non-dual, like Buddhist sort of way, we could say that there is no need to do that necessarily. This leads us back to the idea of speculation. Like, if reality is weirder than we think, then the way in which the different blocks of time place each other in space, the way things arrange themselves in space, the way that consciousness connects to other consciousnesses, or living beings connect with non-living beings, and so on, all these things may be too complicated for us to compute in our understanding of what it means for something to come first and something to come later, So a scientific understanding of the world, like of biology, I understand it needs a notion of past and future, because that helps a lot with studying things, and there is a certain common sense element to that. We derive our lives through this common sense understanding of space and time and all that, and I think that's fine. but at the same time, when talking about emotions and thoughts, I think we're talking about something subjective, and therefore the same rules don't apply, because you can't perform objective experimentation on it. But anyway, that's my little sort of horse that I tend to whip on this channel. So whatever, I'll try to keep it short on that front. Anyway, so because of all this, then I have this sort of strange sort of intuition I want to put into words, that emotion comes before thought. But I mean this in a sort of metaphorical way. So I don't necessarily believe that it actually comes first. And then, I don't know what the placement in time is, because time in itself is sort of like a subjective experience. So that's a tricky one. Well, when I say time is a subjective experience, I mean, well, I don't know what I mean, but let's leave that statement be for the time being. Emotion and physical experience. The way this layering idea, I think, is that I was thinking recently how emotions are perhaps a repetition of physical experience. That's sort of the main thought that drove me to this, I think. If your stomach tenses again and again and again, you get a stomach tension in specific types of situations, then there has to come a point where that stomach tension becomes like an archetypal stomach tension. There isn't just like, this stomach tension on Friday and this stomach tension on Saturday and this other stomach tension on Sunday. If they all have something in common, the commonness between them, I think, becomes aware. Like, you start to notice a pattern between the different physical feelings. And that pattern, it becomes sort of easy for me to think that could be what we call emotion. The shared structures amongst physical processes as they are experienced by the subjective being. So, when we say something like sadness or happiness, it may have something to do with an archetypal physical experience in this way. physical experience itself could also have this archetypal character to it, but that's a little trickier to reason about. I mean, as if, all of it is kind of weird to reason about, but physical experience could have this character to it where also, we talk about the oceanic phase in babies. It's also a common, it's a useful metaphor. I'm using it as a metaphor, at least, where we say, imagine if, it's this sort of like a thought experiment. Imagine if all of your subjective experience were undifferentiated. So there's no difference between this hand and the table. There wasn't really, everything was a big oceanic plenum. And a big oceanic thing, What would it be? What would it consist of? I mean, if I was to analyze it from my perspective, I would say, well, maybe it would consist of things like colors and heat, and sensation and things like that. Like, obviously, I would be tempted to say that, right? That the oceanic experience is kind of like this big bubble of like different sensory experiences, smells and heat, and it's all kind of connected, and there's very difficult to differentiate between things, and then slowly the baby kind of acquires a sort of a tightening of its being. It becomes kind of like, oh yeah, this physical feeling is my face, and that thing is my mother's face, or whatever, So there's that sort of explanation of the oceanic experience. However, of course, and a lot of philosophers have gone into this that I haven't read, but I know that it's a thing, that you can, if you dive deep enough into this question, it gets a little difficult, because what is heat, and what is a smell? Like, before I can even feel heat or a smell, there's already a differentiation. There's a differentiation between heat and smell. If you say that it's just one thing, everything's heat, the oceanic experience is just some sort of vague experience of heat. Smells are experienced as heat. Sounds are experienced as heat. In that case as well, of course, there is hot heat and cold heat. What's the difference between them? It's already differentiated. And of course you could argue, well, yeah, but sure, I mean, a baby may have a oceanic experience, quote unquote, but it does have some sense of a differentiation between something at some level, right? So there still is some differentiation. Okay. But again, here's where I want to sort of remind you that I was using the baby thing as a metaphor. So it's more like, if we're talking about the experience of no experience, that's sort of the problem, right? What would it mean to have a subjective experience where there was no differentiation between anything? It's sort of difficult to imagine. It kind of breaks the categories of what a subjective experience is, at least to me. And because of this, I have a feeling that maybe you could analyze physical experience itself. So heat, all of the sense data, basically. Heat, taste, hearing, and so on, sight. All of these as also somehow eliciting the same patterns that emotion did from physical experience. But maybe that's going way too into the weeds for this video. So, in fact, I'll just leave it at that. I think this is too long for now. Okay, bye. Good night. Bye.